Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming back John McHugh to the channel. Today, we're going to be talking about the flood. Before we start, John, can you just tell us quickly for how long you personally have been studying the flood?
Well, thank you for having me on Esoteric. It's wonderful to be on Esoteric Thoughts. I say hi to all your viewers, and you have quite a channel here. It's definitely thought-provoking, and it really gets you conceptualizing biblical ideas and spiritual ideas in a new light. But I began interest in the flood 1998. In March of 1998, I presented a paper at Creighton University in Nebraska, United States. It's a Catholic university, and it eventually became my master's thesis. And so I've been studying the flood story since 1998, and my interest is the fact that the story elements, initially my interest was the fact that the story elements from Noah's flood correspond to constellations and older Greek and Mesopotamian star atlases. So that's where this all started for me.
So, can you take us through some of the correlations between the flood myth and its celestial origins? But also, can you also touch on some of the literal views held by Christians about the flood?
Yeah. So the idea of a literal flood that once covered the earth was pretty well accepted amongst Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Remember, the flood story is in the Quran as well. But so since its inception into the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians would call the Old Testament, the flood was accepted as a historic event. As an historic event, in fact, later in the presentation, I'll cite the passages where Jesus refers to the flood as a historic event in, I believe it's Matthew and Luke. But everyone really thought of it as a historic flood that covered the earth, and that all began to change with the age of exploration. Once the New World was discovered, the former paradigms for proof that the flood was a literal event just dissipated. They just disappear. You couldn't reconcile them with science anymore.
Okay, can you take us through your presentation?
Sure. So go to my screen share. So, okay. And so let me just get this full screen. Okay, so I got to plug the book for Monkfish. So I'm the author of the Celestial Code of Scripture, which came out in December of 2021. It's the astral cipher underlying the miracle stories of the Bible and the Quran. And it just goes into the fact that many of the miracles reported in the Bible and the Quran correspond to tableaus or still frames in older constellation lists or star atlases from Mesopotamia, which are written in the cuneiform language. And my argument is that there were Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic authors who learned how to translate these stellar picture stories and associated. They're actually comprised of word plays as well. The action is dictated by the word plays. The details are dictated by word plays. And they translated these stellar picture stories and their associated word plays into the written miracle narratives that we see in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran. So some of the astrologer authors that people may not be thinking about, but I think about all the time is, so one of them, the most noteworthy, is Daniel. Your typical person from a Judaic, Christian, or even an Islamic background will probably know that Daniel was a sage. He was a Jewish sage, and he was taken hostage with 3 other Jews by King Nebuchadnezzar II. That was the Babylonian king that basically destroyed Jerusalem and exiled the Jews to Babylonia. He literally rises up to become the head of all the occult scholars in Babylonia. And this, of course, included the astrologers. He's the most noteworthy one. In the ancient world, there was a precedent for vanquishing kings to go in and round up anyone who could divine the future, which of course were the astrologers. That's what astrology is, predicting the future using the stars. So they were often taken hostage. They're literally taken as hostage to astrologers. And all that becomes pertinent to the classical world when you find out that the father of Greek epic alphabetic poetry is Homer, and the name means hostage. And one of the theories that many classical scholars will concede as being possible, or even very likely true, is that Homer was a Babylonian who was taken hostage by Greek slave traders who often came up along the Syrian coastline. Many of those cities at times were under the jurisdiction of Mesopotamian regimes, especially the Assyrians, and that they would be taking these maybe Assyrian or Babylonian astrologers hostage. Homer appears to be one of them. My favorite, as we've discussed in one conversation, my favorite of all time is Berosus. And the reason is Berosus, he wrote a work called the Babylonica in about 281 BC. He's an astrologer. He's writing the history of Babylonia for Greek readers because Babylonia had been taken by Greek descendants of, after the death of Alexander the Great. There was the Seleucids took over this area. They were Greek, and they wanted to move the capital of Babylon to the Tigris River. Berosus wrote a history of his people, and you got to ask yourself, why would an astrologer be asked to write a history of Babylonia? And remember, if history is written in the stars, then he'd be the best person to pick as your historian, because he could read the picture stories in the stars and translate those into writing. One of those is the flood story, as we'll come to see. Another definite astrologer scholar was Jesus. He's often depicted doing his miracles with a magic wand. And so Jews and Christians, excuse me, not Christians, but Jews and, sorry, I didn't mean to accidentally hit the slide. Jews and pagans saw Jesus as as a magician, and they often depict him as in this vase right here, this bowl. It's a glass bowl from I think it's the 4th century or late 3rd century, but he's raising Lazarus from the dead using a magic wand, and that was pretty well accepted by your typical pagan and Jew in the 1st century AD. So these are all these astrologer authors that end up writing scriptures. So one of the chapters in the Celestial Code of Scripture is called Rediscovering Noah's Celestial Flood. And as I said, I'd been studying that since 1998 for like 24 years. And the reason is simply, when you think of the flood story, you've got a flood god, you've got flood waters, you've got the ark, the flood boat, right? You've got the flood hero, you've got the mountains that the flood boat grounds on, that the ark grounds on. You've got the bird release theme. You've in the biblical flood, you got the olive sprig that the dove brings back to the ark. You've got a burning altar. Noah builds an altar, but it facilitates the burning of offerings. So it's a burning altar. You've got the rainbow, and if you look at it in Hebrew, it's actually a kesheth. It's an archer's bow. And then in the Quran, you've got Muhammad telling us that the floodwaters gushed forth from a tanur, which is an oven, which doesn't even make any sense. Like, how did the floodwaters that cover the earth come out of an oven? And my argument is that every one of these story elements corresponds to a constellation. And that was what my master's thesis was on. So I'm just going to show your viewers here. So when we think of Gemini, you look in the middle of your frame there, you see Gemini, the twin mountains, right? It's twin humans, deified humans, but in Mesopotamia, they're twin mountains. The original ark, as we'll come to see a little later in the presentation, is the Argo, which stands nearby. The bird that was released by the flood hero, well, actually Noah, and even in the Babylonian version of the flood, one of the birds is the raven, which corresponds to our Corvus, the raven constellation. The word dove is embedded in the Pleiades, because in Greek celestial mythology, the Pleiades are turned into doves, but it's also found in the original title for the ark. The original title is Ma Gor. Ma means boat, Gor can mean flood, but it can also mean dove. It's literally the cuneiform sign for dove. So it can be a dove boat or a flood boat in Mesopotamia, and we'll see that in a few slides later. Interestingly, the rainbow that God puts in the sky in the Old Testament flood story is literally an archer's bow. It's a casheth. There's an archer's bow constellation right next to the original flood boat constellation in Mesopotamia. It's called, it's what we would today call Canis Major. It's just, it's called Bon in Sumerian, just means bow, archer's bow. But also, remember, Noah builds a burning altar. He builds an altar that's meant to facilitate burnt offerings. And so that also corresponds to a Greek constellation called Ara, which is a burning altar. Interestingly, it's depicted upside down. It's right next to the ark, the original ark constellation, Argo. And I believe the idea was that the smoke, that's the Milky Way that goes just to the right of that altar. And the Milky Way kind of embodied the smoke that was coming out of this burning altar. So that's what my master's thesis was about. That's the title of it. I wrote it, it got published in 1999. It's The Deluge, a mythical story that was projected onto the constellations. I want to emphasize something. I went to Brigham Young University, which is a Mormon university. Mormons are fundamentalist in the sense that the stories of the Bible have to be historic in Mormon belief, in the Mormon belief system. So I wanted to say nothing about a story that was depicted onto the constellations. I just wanted to say it, the deluge of a flood that correlates with a picture story in the stars. They made me say, my professors made me say that was a story that was depicted in the constellations, with the idea that this picture story was a way to remember an historic event, which I can't disprove. It's not my argument, but we'll get into reasons why I don't embrace that viewpoint. I forget what chapter, it's like chapter 8 in the Celestial Code of Scripture is called Rediscovering Noah's Ark. Oh, sorry. This is actually, Good Morning America did a presentation on this in like January of 2000. I remember I was in the field excavating for my company. I worked for a contract archaeology firm, and they called me. I thought they were joking, and I was like, "Oh yeah, we want to do a story on your master's thesis." So that's what they called it: Rediscovering Noah's Ark in the Stars. And your viewers are going to get to rediscover Noah's Ark with us, but it's not where you think. It's not in the dirt. So to track the flood story, I want to track it from a Judeo-Christian point of view. because that's when you begin to see the rationale for how people thought the way they did about the flood. So an overview of Noah's flood and the quest for Noah's Ark. Because remember, there's always been the fundamentalist desire to prove that the Bible was a historic book. And what better way to do that than find the ultimate relic, Noah's Ark? And that's why the Noah's flood story has been such a lightning rod when it comes to proof or disproof of the Bible as a historic text. So you know, almost every artistic piece you see from the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries depicts the biblical account of the flood, the animals walking either onto or off of the ark 2 by 2, and this giant boat as described in the Bible. I forget, it was like 300, I think it ends up being like 450 feet. And I forget the other dimensions. It's like 450 feet long, 150 feet high, and like 75 feet wide or something. I'd have to look it up again because they're going off of cubits. And but anyway, there's another picture of it. These are, I think I'm showing you 17th and 18th century paintings of the scene. And what I want to emphasize for your viewers is that from its inception into Genesis, which probably occurred a little bit after 500 BC, Russell Gmirkin's, I'm a proponent of his. I believe the Bible is a very late text, the Old Testament, that is. And the earliest, the Genesis flood story could have been actually written down, would have been about 500 BC. And since that point, generations of Jews, Christians, and later Muslims accepted the deluge narrative with Noah, the Noah flood story, as unequivocal truth, to the point where you would be considered an idiot if you questioned it. You know, there were 1600 BC and you said, I don't think the flood happened, excuse me, AD, and you said, I don't think the flood happened. People would look at you like you were confused. So some other verses that support the idea that Noah's flood was factual history. Genesis, of course, the stories recounted in Genesis, starts in Genesis 6, ends in Genesis 8. Isaiah 54:9 refers to it as a historic event. Psalms 29:10 says Yahweh sits at the flood, which is interesting. Yahweh sits at the flood, and we'll get into why that's so interesting in a little bit later. But Jesus refers to Noah's flood as an historic event in the passages you see there, Matthew 24:37 through 39, and Luke 17:26 and 27. So Jews and Christians, from the inception of the flood story into the Old Testament, Jews and Christians accepted the flood story as literal truth all the way up until the time of the age of exploration, when Christopher Columbus discovered the New World and actually passed it on to other scholars, you know, because it's very likely Leif Erikson discovered it long before Columbus, but and of course Native Americans were already living there for thousands of years, so much for discovering. But when they came back and they said, hey, there's this whole nother continent with all these animal species we've never even heard of. So all of a sudden, Christian fundamentalists had to say, well, wait a minute, how do we explain all of these species, over 2 million species, somehow making it to and from the ark after a global flood? You had to ask. So now all of a sudden, you got the best minds in the world saying to themselves, well, wait a minute, how did the Australian kangaroo, the American bison, the South American tree sloth suddenly trek, hike, swim, and then repeat the whole process so they could make it to the ark and then return from whence they came to replicate the species and perpetrate the species again? And the questions are just obvious. You know, your typical third grader can answer them now, but how did Noah cram a mating pair of each of the 2 million species onto a barge whose perimeter was not much larger than a soccer field? In ancient times, this boat sounded gargantuan, but in modern times, when you're dealing with 2 million animal species, it's looking like an extremely small boat. How did he feed them and dispose of their waste? Where was the food kept? They never mention this in the biblical flood story. How did he keep predators and prey species separate? One one attack of a lion on a, for instance, zebra, and the zebra species would go extinct. So how is Noah keeping the prey and predator species separate? And the hydrological studies were just showing that there wasn't enough water on Earth to cover all of the mountaintops. There just isn't enough H2O on the Earth to cover the highest mountains, as is described in Genesis 7:18-20. So the question was like, how do we explain these facts, you know? And the big one, here's the big one that really stumped everybody. And it was, if there was a global flood and everything was inundated except for the pairs of species that made it to the ark, when the water started to abate and recede, where were they draining into? The whole earth is totally saturated and covered. Exactly where were these waters going to? So that was the main, that was really the question that stumped everybody. And then there was Charles Darwin's Origin of the Species, which gave more credence and weight to the idea that the flood couldn't have been literal. And the way he did that is just showing that our human species evolved from earlier ancestors over the process of natural selection, and that, quite frankly, we are just like the animals. We have evolved from more primitive species that you see in nature. And by 1900, even the great Old Testament scholar, and you got to give him credit for saying this, Samuel Rolls Driver says, you know, he's speaking for all the science-minded theologians now when he says this. He says, we are forced consequently to the conclusion that the flood, as described by the biblical writers, is unhistorical. And this was really crushing to the theologians of the day. And you started to get this bifurcation of people who were fundamentalist and people who just couldn't believe the Bible was any longer a history book. And the reason that starts to get really interesting for me, especially as someone who, you know, studied cuneiform and you know, has read the text that the oldest flood story is based on. So you have just biblical scholarship in turmoil. Then in 1872, George Smith discovers the Gilgamesh epic version of the flood story. And that's what the biblical account's based on. You know, it's one of the ones the biblical account's based on. And all of a sudden, the wheels clicked. The biblical flood is based on an older flood story from Mesopotamia. And that made it possible for people to say that the flood story, if you're saying that the flood story was based on a Mesopotamian deluge, then it suddenly reopened the possibility that it was a historic event. Only what the difference being that the world, in quotation marks, of the southern Mesopotamian people who experienced devastating floods all the time was destroyed. And this regional, localized cataclysm was reported and translated and written down and then passed on word of mouth to surrounding cultures. And that's where you get this idea of a historic flood. But the bottom line is the biblical flood is actually based on a historic event. Therefore, the Noah's flood story has a kernel of historicity. That's why this is so special. And in fact, Sir Leonard Woolley in 1929 thought he found evidence of a destructive cataclysmic flood in Mesopotamia at the city of Ur, and he's written papers on that. The problem with that is this flood didn't destroy the whole city. I think he found, like, I thought, I'm going off a dead reckoning here, but I remember it was like 9 feet of you know, soil deposition from a flood, but the whole city wasn't even destroyed. And his protege, Emmy L. Mallowan, who ended up being Agatha Christie's husband, He said that this flood is probably the flood that became the biblical flood, but that it was truly a regional flood, and it probably dates to about 2800 BC. Woolley had placed this flood at about, I think, 3400 to 3200 BC, which is pre-literate. Personally, I like Woolley's dates better, but there's a picture, an up close layer of this flood deposit that Leonard Woolley said was the flood that it was the inspiration for the biblical flood story. Now, the reason that becomes interesting and where Berosus comes in, again, if you're going to go back in time, this is the guy you want to interview. He's a 3rd century astrologer. He sets, not only, he writes the Babylonica, and he talks about this flood boat being stranded on the mountains in Armenia, and people going there and getting relics from it, like scraping off the bitumen and making these little amulets, like for to wear around your neck to protect yourself from poisons and things like that. And what's interesting about Berosus, he's an astrologer. Now, again, why would an astrologer write history? Well, if your history is based on picture stories in the stars, there wouldn't be anyone better to choose as your historian. Just so everyone knows, he went on and moved to Greece and set up an astrological school on the Greek Isle of Kos. And he did that, sometime after 281 BC. So he's the one that first says, yeah, they know where the boat is, and they're going to it and getting relics from the earliest flood boat, from the original flood boat. And more intriguing story, coming from my own Roman Catholic background, is, so you have Saint Jacob of Nisibis. He's a Turkish Christian saint. He supposedly in the 4th century actually climbed up Mount Ararat, and in search of Noah's Ark, he's looking for the relic. He was greeted by an angel, and the angel chastised him and said, God doesn't want you looking for the ark, but he said, to prove to you that the ark is real, I'm going to give you a relic to bring back and show everybody. So the angel supposedly gives Jacob a hunk of wood to bring down and show everybody and prove that Noah's Ark is real, with the admonition to not try to climb Mount Ararat to find the ark anymore. So he said, also he noted that it looked like it was cut by an axe, and today we'd say, well, that means it's fake. Well, to the early Christians, that meant, well, the angel must have just grabbed an axe and chopped a hunk of wood from the ark. And so it's just ironic that today there's double entendre going on. Like back then, chopping wood from the ark with an axe would have proved that it was real, and today we're like, nah, it's not real. Yeah, it's fake. So there's actually the centerpiece in that cross right there is from an Armenian church on the slopes of Ararat, and it's supposed to be wood from this relic that St. Jacob brought down from Mount Ararat. This became this whole desire to find Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat. First of all, it's not, if you look at the biblical Hebrew, the term they use, it's the plural term. It's the mountains of Ararat. And Ararat it's the biblical term for Urartu. It's the Kurdish mountains, in Turkey. They're actually mentioned in Babylonian texts, and in the Babylonian flood story in the Gilgamesh epic, Tablet 11, the ark grounds on the mountains of Nimush. Nobody really knows where Nimush is, other than there's a geographical text that mentions them in Kurdistan, in what we would call the land of the Kurds in Armenia, on the border of Armenia and Kurdistan. So this guy, Fernand Navarro, who's a Seventh-day Adventist, actually climbed Mount Ararat looking for the Ark. And he says he found this hewn wood, this wood on the slopes of Ararat. And his argument was, well, it washed down from where Noah's Ark is. Sounds like a good story. And in fact, it spawned this idea that Noah's Ark is actually on Mount Ararat. A whole bunch of travelers in the 19th century repeated what Berosus and St. Jacob had said, you know, over 1,000 years earlier, in some cases 2,000 years earlier. This image actually is from 62 years ago today. This is from Life magazine, September 5th, 1960. And this shows this, it's a plane, photography from a plane, which shows a giant canoe-shaped or boat-shaped geologic formation on Mount Ararat. And the argument is this is Noah's Ark. And that's connected to Navarra climbing up and claiming he found wood from the Ark. It spawned this book and then a documentary that came out in 1976. And I remember it to this day. I saw it like 3 times when I was in like 6th grade. You can actually watch it. I've put up the YouTube URL right there. You can watch it from 1976. It's based on the search for Noah's Ark. That was what the book it was based on. And it was so misleading and so untruthworthy that an institution called the Religion and Ethics Institute, who are science-minded theologians, said we've got to publish a subsequent book to show everything they told that was misleading or flat out wrong. And it's a good book. The book's called The Noah's Ark Nonsense. You can still probably get it on Amazon. It's in the library I do all my research at, and that was published in 1978. But I want to emphasize that that movie that your viewers can now go on and watch is full of just absolute, I don't want to say lies, but untruths. So there's Mount Ararat, a painting, the animals coming down 2 by 2. And so the interesting question is, what about this wood that Navarro comes down with? He says clearly it's cut, it's chopped, it's been worked. And when he brought it to the lab, they did radiocarbon dates on it, and they all clustered around 640 AD. The earliest date was 260 AD, the latest 790 AD, and they're all too late to be wood from Christ's time, let alone Noah's time. So why this date? What's going on here? Well, what is mentioned in that book, The Noah's Ark Nonsense, and in just past research I've done, because early Christians saw Mount Ararat as a sacred ground, they built, many Christian monks went there to live ascetic lives on the slopes of Ararat, on this sacred mountain. And but to do so, it's very cold up there, and you must bring up your own firewood. You have to bring up wood to make little huts to live in. And, you know, so the irony is, so these early Christian monks are going up there to honor God, but they're hauling a lot of wood up the slopes of Ararat. And this is very likely what Navarro brought back. He probably brought back a hunk of cut wood from these Christian pilgrims, or hermits, if you will. It's not clear if they were just doing pilgrimages or they were living there. In the 1600s, it's unequivocal that Christian monks were going there to live out their days and live ascetic lives. It's very likely that that's based on an earlier tradition, and that would make sense for Navarro's radiocarbon dates for the wood he brought down from Ararat. And there's, that's just what I summarized there. So there's this tradition since Jacob of Nisibis that in the early 300s, that the ark's up on Mount Ararat. The Bible itself says it's on the mountains in Urartu, and Urartu is just it's the land of the Kurds. It's northern Iraq and southern Turkey, and there's a testament there. You can see a picture of the ark on the Armenian territory, sitting on Mount Ararat. So anyway, it's very likely the Navarre comes down with this wood from the monks that were honoring the Noah's Ark flood story and try to live out these holy lives on the slopes of this deemed sacred mountain. So where does the Noah's Ark story begin? And that's where it starts to get really interesting. We've mentioned that the biblical flood story is based on an older Mesopotamian account that wasn't even discovered until 1872. But the interesting thing about that flood story, which just I might get a little bit, impassioned here and a little animated, is the flood story shows up out of the blue in writing in the middle of the 21st century BC. So about 2050 BC, you get the first ever reference to the flood, a great flood. And it comes in a text called the Sumerian King List. So I want to emphasize something. The reason this is all crucial is so the Sumerian King List gives the first reference to the flood. However, it's likely that the Sumerian King List is being written by a bilingual dynasty that knew the Akkadian language, which is Babylonian and Assyrian, and simultaneously knew the Sumerian language. And one of the great Sumerologists, Miguel Seville, says, the theme of a flood which destroys mankind does not seem to belong to the main body of Sumerian traditions. Allusions to it are lacking in the texts, which are presumed to go back to older originals and so best represent Sumerian literary themes. So the thought was, well, look, if the flood's first mentioned in this text called the Sumerian King List, well, the Sumerians invent writing. So there's going to be an older version of the flood story somewhere in southern Mesopotamia, and we just got to find the text, right? So the problem with that, I want to go into the King List, is there just isn't, and that's why I quoted Seville there. There just isn't a Sumerian flood story, and I'll get to that for a second, because they're going to say, no, there's a Sumerian flood story. There is, but it's written by the Babylonians. But so you look at this Sumerian King List, written 2050 BC, first ever reference to the flood. And it's a very mythical or legendary text. It says that there are eight pre-Diluvian kings who reigned for 241,200 years before the flood. Put that in perspective, human beings, you and I, Homo sapiens sapiens, have only been around for 100,000 years. So this flood story is written when the most dominant human species is Homo erectus, which is, is a man ape, and there's no way Homo erectus was building gigantic arcs. So the names of the eight pre-flood kings are interesting. One's, by the way, I use capital letters because it's just scholars transliterate Sumerian into capitals and Akkadian, which is Babylonian and Assyrian, into italics. So I use capitals. So Alulim is the first king. He's reigning for 28,800 years. Al-Lalgar's reigning for 36,000 years. Main Luana is reigning for 43,200 years. By the way, the Ain just means Lord. It's just an honorific. It means like doctor or, Mr., Mrs., things like that, sir. Main Galana, he reigns for 28,800 years. Dingir Dumuzi, the god Dumuzi, reigns for 36,000 years. Sipa Ziana reigns for 28,800 years. Main Dur Ana reigns for 21,000 years. And Ubartutu reigns for 18,600 years. Obviously, these are mythical reigns. There's no way a king can live for 20-some thousand years. Then right after, they name the king, tell the number, they name the city he reigned in, the southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerian city he reigned in, and then they give you the number of years the king reigned. And then right after those 8 kings are named, you get these words: the flood swept thereover. After the flood had swept thereover, when the kingship was lowered from heaven, which is the sky, the kingship was in the city Kish, southern Mesopotamian city of Kish. Now, the reason that those names start to become really, really important to me is because for this reason. So Al-Lulim, the name means horn of the stag. Well, Lulim is the stag constellation. Okay, there's a stag constellation in Mesopotamia, and Al-Lulim refers to its horns. Al-Lalgar, Al just can mean, it can mean shores. Lalgar means, it's a synonym for Absu. So the Abzu is the shore of the celestial sea. So that's what you're literally looking at. So you're like, wait a minute, we're in the stars here. Main Lu Ana, crown of the man of the sky. Well, main literally just means crown. Lu just means man, and Ana means of the sky or in the sky. So main's constellation. So you got a crown in the sky. Well, there's a crown constellation in the sky. And I'm wondering, wait, is this relating to this crown of the man of the sky and the great crown of the sky? But then what really becomes just unequivocal, Dingir Dumuzi. The Dumuzi just means faithful son. Dingir means deity. It's the faithful sun god. Dumuzi is the constellation Orion. It's not like sort of, like it is. He is the constellation Orion. Sipa Ziana, faithful shepherd of the skies, it's the astronomical title for Orion. So now we're in the skies. Main Dor Ana, crowned bond of the skies. Another, the Hyades is, you'll see in a second, is described as the crown constellation. Ubartutu, vanquishing divine protection, is what the name might mean. That's the only one I can't correspond to a constellation. Alulim, so Andromeda in Mesopotamia is referred to as the Lulim constellation, the stag constellation. Would be, somewhere this stag has horns. So some of the stars of Lulim are depicted as horns. So this king corresponds to the horns of the stag constellation. So the crown constellation, there's a picture of Taurus. So the Hyades is the jawbone of the bull. And it's the whole face, actually, which includes the upper and the mandible and the maxilla of the jaw. And it's defined as a crown constellation, maybe because of the way it was shaped. But in Sumerian, it's referred to as Main, and that's the operant title of these kings. Their name's Main, crown man of the sky, great crown of the sky, etc. But the Akkadian title is Agu, which means crown. And the people who are writing the Sumerian king list are actually Akkadian speakers. And if they're not speaking Akkadian as their mother tongue, they're fluent in Akkadian. But it's very likely they're Akkadian speakers. So if you wanted to put this in a star atlas, I already showed you that, Andromeda corresponds to Alulim. Okay, Alulim is on a different frame. It doesn't fit into this tableau. But the other constellations are right here. You can see in the middle of your screen where it says Main Luana, Main Galana, Main Dorana. They're variations of crown of the skies, crown of the skies, crown of the skies. And the crown constellation is, it's the Hyades, and it comes right out of Mesopotamian star atlases. I'm not even extrapolating there. That comes right out of Mesopotamian star atlases. Dumuzi is Orion. It's mentioned in, astronomical tablets. Sipaziana, the faithful shepherd of the skies, in the middle of the screen there, is Orion. Alalgar, shore of the Abzu. Well, the Abzu is the wet region of the night sky. So the shore of the Abzu is this king Alalgar, shore of the Abzu. So here's where it starts to get really, really intriguing, especially if you take a look for a minute at that Hyades asterism in Taurus in the middle of your screen, in the upper middle of your screen. The Akkadian title for that constellation is Agu. And the reason that that is interesting is Agu in Akkadian, it means crown, but Agu also means devastating flood. And my argument is the reason that the flood shows up out of the blue, middle of the 21st century, is that you suddenly have these bilingual astronomer historians or astronomer scholars who know that, oh, wait a minute, Agu means crown, but in our language, it means devastating flood. Well, obviously, there was a devastating flood. So who were the kings? Well, we got them. We got a picture of them right there in the stars. Now, I don't know why they're picking certain constellations over and over again, but the idea of this giant flood that covers all of Mesopotamia, remember, there's not evidence of a catastrophic flood globally at all, but there's not even evidence of a catastrophic universal southern Mesopotamian flood. In fact, the main flood, the main archaeological evidence posed for the flood is at Ur, and that didn't even destroy the whole city. So the archaeologists are working really hard, and really, the evidence feels contrived if you say there's evidence for, a regional, flood. So I have a problem with that one. However, there's a devastating flood in the stars. So again, you have this celestial sea, the Abzu. It's always referred to that in Sumerian. It's literally the wet region of the night sky where you have the 8 contiguous aquatic constellations. So now all of a sudden you have, this word that says crown that also means devastating flood right above the wet region of the night sky. And it's very likely that that became the basis for the idea that the world was covered in a devastating flood. Because in the ancient times, the reason miracles are possible is because people are reading, the scholars are reading picture stories in the stars as still frames of historic events. And then they're looking for wordplay, what we would call homophones, homonyms, synonyms. And then they're using those to refine and discern the details. Okay. Ironically, if you look at Aquarius on the right side of your screen, Aquarius is the god that causes this flood. He's Enki Ea. He is Aquarius. So you go along. The Sumerian king list mentioned about 2050 BC. 2 terse sentences referring to the deluge. There's no story, no flood god, no ark, no flood hero, no mountains, no bird release scene, no olive sprig, no rainbow, no burning altar, and no oven. Remember, the flood waters come out of an oven in the Quranic story of the flood. And all of a sudden, over 300 years later, there's the tale of Atrahasis. And all of a sudden, we have this full-blown story. And it describes a 7-day flood. The creator of the flood is the constellation god Ea, who's embedded in Aquarius, or Enki. His Sumerian name's Enki. We've got a flood hero. His name's Atrahasis, exceedingly wise. We've got an ark. We have a denouement. There's a whole theme. And the theme is that the flood hero is the first human to be granted immortality by surviving the deluge, basically. And it's interesting. Why would they let him survive the deluge when they wanted to eradicate mankind? So, by the way, the reason that the gods wanted to eradicate mankind is one of the high-ranking deities, Enlil. He's embodied in Boötes, our constellation of the herdsman. The noise of the human beings is keeping him from sleep, which is an interesting theme considering today. And that's why he just wants to wipe out humanity. And Enki Ea, who basically created human beings, says, hey, I'm going to whisper that there's going to be this big flood coming, and I've got to make this flood. So I'm going to tell my devotee, Atrahasis, to build an ark, you know. So the God who creates the flood, it's unequivocal. It's Aquarius. He's right out of star atlases. His Babylonian title is Ea. His Sumerian title is Enki. And again, you can see him there in the right side of your screen. You have Ea, Enki embodied in Aquarius. He literally lives in the floodwaters he's created. And it's interesting to me that the Psalms mentions that Yahweh sits at the flood, which doesn't really make any sense. And I'll go into that in a second. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. So you see the flood hero there. You see the word devastating flood up there in Taurus. Now this wet region of the night sky becomes the scene of a devastating flood, catastrophic flood. The ship in ancient Mesopotamia on your lower right-hand side, we today call it Argo. But in the oldest flood story, it literally just says, you know, the warrior, the god Enlil, saw the Makuru boat. Now, Makuru boat is just, it's a cargo boat. It's a very large cargo boat. And its Babylonian title is Makuru, but its Akkadian title is Magor. And the reason it's intriguing with all this connection to the stars is, well, Magor is a constellation. So the earliest flood boat is listed as a constellation in the southern region of the night sky. And its Sumerian title is Ma Gor. You can see it down there at the bottom, that Ma 2, Gor 8. There's so many homophones in cuneiform writing that linguists have to show the difference. So like there's a Ma 1, Ma 2, Ma 3, Ma 4, 5, 6. And Gor, I think there's like 29 Gor signs. And Gor 8 is the term they use. Gor 8 also means flood. So you can translate this as the Gor boat, which is a kind of cargo boat, or you can also translate this as the flood boat. And Gor 8 is literally one of the titles for flood. There are many of them. So the reason the Magor is so interesting to me, because it's a deified ship. It's listed as a constellation in the southern region of the night sky in cuneiform star atlases. In the myth Gilgamesh and Aga, I think it's line 98, a Magor gets its bow chopped off. The whole front of the boat gets cut off. So all of a sudden you're saying, well, so there's the Magor boat. It's a deity. It means flood boat. It's the flood hero's ark. It's the original ark. It's a constellation in the southern region of the night sky, and it gets its bow chopped off in a Sumerian myth. So is there a divine boat constellation floating around the southern region of the night sky that has its prow torn off? And the Argo is it's a southern constellation. It's a deified, it's literally defined as a god, southern constellation, and its bow is chopped off, and it's in the southern region of the night sky. So it's very likely the Magor became the Argo. In fact, if you look at the Akkadian term for Magor, if its bow is chopped off, it would depict a stern, which is Arku in Akkadian. And when you translate Arku into Greek, you get Argu, which is, it just means, it's what the word for Argo, it means swift, it just means fast. So you literally not only get the constellation, you actually even get the constellation's name, Argu, which is probably because Homer was a Babylonian astrologer who was taken hostage, hence the name Homer, hostage. And he is reading these stellar picture stories. And now he learns Greek and he starts translating, okay. And he goes, now we're going to read these picture stories and we're going to show you what your Greek ancestry is. So the constellations are a pictographic repository of history, if you will. So there's also some variations. The later versions of the tale of Atrahasis, you get the idea that the flood boat, the sides of the flood boat are equal. and I go into this in the book. I got to make some linguistic arguments here, but there are breaks in the tablet in Tale of Atrahasis, but there aren't any breaks in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So we know what was said. So put it in perspective, give it its celestial context. Gilgamesh, who's the bull slayer, he's the one who stabs Taurus and kills Taurus. So he's probably embodied in Perseus. But Gilgamesh, he literally climbs the Twin Mountains constellation, Gemini, and climbs and goes onto the ecliptic, which is it's called the Kaskal Dingir Utu is what it's called in Sumerian, the path of the sun god. So he's literally going along the path of the sun god, which is the ecliptic. It's the path the sun traces through the zodiac. And while he's there, he gets to, because that's where Utnapishtim is. He's got to go there to get to see the flood hero, who has been granted immortality at the mouth of the rivers, or at the opening of the rivers. Okay. So when he finally reaches Utnapishtim says, well, let me tell you this story. I'll tell you what happened to me. And he's quoting Enki Aquarius, or Ea Aquarius. He's quoting the god, the flood god, the god who created the flood here. And the flood god told him, the god Aquarius told him, the boat that you are going to build, her dimensions should all correspond. Her breadth and length should be equal, should be the same. So we know that. In the next line, he says the boat's going to look like an ashiku. And the problem with ashiku is it literally means one field. In English, it would be, we would translate it as an acre. An iku is a area, it's a surface area 60 meters. So when he says the flood boat's going to be an iku, he's saying that the flood boat's going to be a 60-meter cube, and all of earthly life is going to fit on this 60-meter cube. There's actually a picture of it in the Egyptian calendar of Dendera. Remember, they're Greek. So instead of recording this as Pegasus, the Pegasus square, they chose to retain its Mesopotamian original image, which is iku, which means field. So the Babylonian ark isn't that Magor boat. It's in the shape of an iku, which is a square field. And if you extrapolate that into 3 dimensions, it becomes a cube. There it is there. The iku constellation is the Pegasus square. And to put it in perspective, the reason it was so important in Mesopotamia, so I don't show it in this picture, but it's straddled by Pisces, and Pisces is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So the Tigris and Euphrates would flood, and you had to control those floods with dikes and levees to irrigate the fields. So the foundation of economic stability in Mesopotamia, which is irrigation, floodplain agriculture, is depicted in stars. Enki Aquarius, or Ea Aquarius, causes the flood waters every year. They flood the field, and there's a hired worker constellation, Aries. He's sometimes depicted as just the man. His title sometimes is just man, and he uses his plow, which is triangulum, to plow the field constellation. Now, all of a sudden, this field's the flood boat, possibly because one of the terms for square or box or chest, which is what this iku can also mean box or chest. And one of its reading is ma, and ma is the Sumerian word for boat. So that's probably where they got the idea that this constellation is a boat, because it doesn't make any sense. They didn't make cubical boats. 60-meter cubical boats wouldn't even float. It doesn't make any rational sense, but they're reading stellar picture stories as historic events, and they write down exactly what they see, regardless of whether or not it conforms with natural law or rational thought. That's why miracles are possible. So even Sumerian texts describe this field constellation, which can also be read boat, as at the edges of the boundary of the Abzu. So it's right at the edge, it's partially submerged in the Abzu, the celestial waters, which again are identified as a devastating flood when you're reading the stars as a pictographic script of history. So then you can have a global flood. Well, how do you know there was a global flood? Well, there's a picture of it in the stars. You don't need proof. You've got a picture of it in the stars. That's why they weren't saying in Babylonia, saying, well, do we have flood layers in northern Mesopotamia to prove the flood? Well, no, they didn't think that way. They said, I can show you a picture of the flood story in the stars. And if you saw it in the stars, that proved it actually happened on Earth. So there's your flood boat in the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's the Aku, which is it's a field boat, and they don't exist. There's no such thing. I've read all the texts on the water transportation in Mesopotamia. There aren't any. So the next part you might want to say is, well, how did Yahweh get equated with Aquarius, who's the Babylonian god Ea, who causes the flood, or Enki in Sumerian? They both cause the flood. They're the same guy, the same deity. How could that be? Well, one of Aquarius's, Ea's epithets is Edim. It just means springs, as in spring water, like drinkable water. They called it sweet water, meaning you could drink it, as opposed to bitter water, which was salt water, which you couldn't drink it. So one of his epithets is Edim. It means spring, but it's also read May, or it looks like the word me in English, but May. It can be translated in Sumerian, he will be. And that's what Yahweh means. It means he will be. So one of the epithets for Aquarius, Ea, the guy who called the flood god, is he will be. That's why in Psalms 29, I believe it was, they say Yahweh sits at the flood. He sits in the flood. He's in the flood waters. And there's a picture of him. You see him in the lower right there. Ea, Aquarius. We'll just insert the title Yahweh there. So anyway, so I just wanted to point out something. So you think about the mysterious title for Noah's Ark. So Noah's Ark is in archaic Hebrew, it would have been Tebat. It's literally the word box or chest. That's all it means. And it doesn't have a Hebrew etymology. So everybody's thinking, well, there's something like that. Tepat in Egyptian, it's one of the few times I've actually had to look up the hieroglyphics. That's the word for coffin or chest or box. So maybe it's Egyptian. I'm not arguing that it's not. But I think a better argument is that it's Mesopotamian. So remember the Babylonian, the Epic of Gilgamesh flood story. Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh is the flood boat, the ark is an Iku, right? Well, Iku means field, but it also means box. And if you were writing, cuneiform is very cumbersome, and you wanted to use as little wedges as possible. So one of the fast ways to write box in cuneiform, if you were talking about the stars, is you could write mul p, which means it's the abbreviated form of box. So they write mul p. Now, one of the alternate readings for mul p is te. And one of the alternate readings for the P sign there, that second cuneiform sign you see, is ba. So embedded in the words constellation box are the words Tebat. And it's very likely, remember, the authors of the biblical flood story were scholars like Daniel. They were literally Babylonian astrologers. They knew how to read the stellar picture stories and translate them into writing. So it's very likely constellation box became the title for the Hebrew flood boat, the Hebrew ark, Tebat, which means box or chest. So Noah's Ark is very likely either embedded in the idea of Argo, which is the oldest ark from the Atrahasis story, the earliest flood story, or from the Epic of Gilgamesh flood story, where it's unequivocally identified as a box. Pretty sure it's the Epic of Gilgamesh. I would go with that one more than the older version, because Tebat literally is alternate readings for the signs constellation box. So all this starts to get incredibly fascinating and mysterious when you turn to the Quran. So in two places, the Quran tells us that Noah's floodwaters, it was a flood, it covered the earth, it killed all living things except everyone who boarded the ark. And in two places, we learn that the floodwaters came out of an oven. And you're like, an oven, a tanur, an oven. And the reason that that's fascinating is because, here it is right here in Surah 11, 40 through 44. So Noah's, they tell him, so Allah tells Noah, he built an ark, and he says, and when, ironically, Allah can't even evade his polytheistic origins in this story. So they're referring to Allah in the plural. They're going in and out of the plural for the single God, the God. So they're saying, and when Allah's will was done and the water welled up from the oven, tanur, we, again, it's in the plural, said to Noah, take into the ark a pair from every species, your tribe, except for those that are already doomed, and all the true believers, right? So that's a tanur. That's what the floodwaters come out of in the Quranic flood story. Tanur is just a cooking oven. It's usually used to make, you can see the bread there, the flat bread that they're used, the unleavened bread they used they cooked in it there. I've excavated one of these in Syria, actually, at a place called Tel Marra in near Aleppo. But you got to remember, you might say, well, what does all that mean? That's just bizarre, right? Well, not if you turn to the stars, it's not. And you see all the way throughout the Quran that Muhammad is alluding to the Quran's pagan celestial origins. So in two tablets in the Quran, as you can see there on the screen, the Quran is referred to as a celestial tablet that's kept in heaven, that's kept in the sky. In 9 different places, there were a group of pagan Arabs that didn't believe Muhammad. They would not convert to Islam. And they said, oh, he's just telling asatir, myths of the ancients. They're fables of the ancients. They're celestial mythology. It's the stories of the celestial mythology of the ancient pagan world that was circulating in Arabia. And you see aspects of it showing up in several of the Quranic chapters. Chapter 53 is Al-Najm, the star. Chapter 54 is Al-Qamar, the moon. Chapter 85 is Al-Buruj, means the zodiac. Chapter 91 is Al-Shams, the sun. And the reason these are so pellucidly pagan is because Muhammad is being tutored by a Persian magician named Salman al-Farsi. And Salman is dictating, remember, Muhammad's illiterate. He's dictating these celestial myths. And then as Muhammad learns them, he's going forth and reciting them to his tribe, the Quraysh, and he's reciting them, and they are saying, oh, this is indigenous Islamic revelation. And that's why you get these celestial pagan foundations showing up, this facade showing up in the Quran. But so that's why the Quran itself is called the recital. Al-Quran means the recitation or the recital, because that's what Muhammad's doing. He's reciting the celestial myths that Salman al-Farsi has dictated to him. Now, the reason that starts to get interesting is surely because he was one of the Magi, Salman al-Farsi understood that the flood story was based on a picture story in the stars. So remember that our constellation, remember it was called Iku? Well, Iku, remember, it's got, I mean, the Iku sign has, I think it has like 16 different readings, but one of them is Ga, and Ga means box, okay? And it also, Iku also means to carry floodwaters. And the reason that's interesting is a synonym for Iku is the Sheed sign. And it also means box, but it's also read gear, and gear is just the word for oven. So all of a sudden, through what Mesopotamian astrologers would call constellation writing or Lamashi writing, wordplay in the constellation titles, images and titles, you get the words, the ark, the boat, which is the ark, carries floodwaters, and it's an oven. And that's very likely what Salman al-Farsi taught Muhammad. So Muhammad worked that into lucid Arabic and then reported that the floodwaters came out of an oven, you know, because he's looking at the picture story in the stars because Salman al-Farsi is teaching it to him. And that's what I believe the origin for the idea of the floodwaters coming out of an oven in the Quranic version of the flood. So I wanted to just point out that so you can actually find Noah. So Noah's name in Hebrew, his name's Noach, and it just means resting, to rest or resting. So in the oldest version of the flood story and in the Gilgamesh epic of the flood story, which is younger than the oldest version, the oldest one's the Tale of Atrahasis. The Gilgamesh epic version is, you know, a few hundred years later than that. But so Enlil, who's embodied in the constellation Boötes, he says, in the past, the flood hero Utnapishtim was one of mankind, but now Utnapishtim and his woman, his wife, shall be like gods. Utnapishtim shall dwell far off at the mouth of the rivers. And so he tells Gilgamesh, he says, they took me and they settled me far off at the mouth of the rivers. Now remember, to find this place, Gilgamesh has had to climb over, he had to basically scale the constellation Gemini, which are the mountains constellation, climb on the ecliptic, follow the path of the sun through the zodiac to find Utnapishtim. Well, he's going to be at the mouth of the river. So where are these rivers? Well, the term they use, they would write it in cuneiform and says Ina Pi Idmeish, which literally means at the mouth or at the opening of the rivers. Eid's just the Sumerian word for river, and Meish is just the plural marker. So at the opening of the rivers, each one of those, you know, they're written in cuneiform. So it's about 7 cuneiform signs because it's horrible to write in cuneiform. It takes so many signs. So you might say, well, where is this mouth of the rivers? Well, one of the titles for look at the left of your screen there. So Ares is not a ram in Mesopotamia. He's a hired worker, but they often abbreviate his name. They abbreviate it sometimes to Hun, sometimes to Hunga, and sometimes to just Lu, because they're trying to shorten the writing Lu Hunga. So Hunga is the Sumerian title that means resting. It literally means in Akkadian, Nuahu. And if you translate Nuahu, it's literally a one-to-one translation. The U at the end of Nuahu is called a case ending. That just flies off. It's the nominative case ending. So it's just Nuach is the base word. Nuach is literally Noah. That's literally what it translates in Hebrew. So where is he? Well, you get this guy named Resting or Noah standing embodied in Aries. And where is he? He's right in front of the Ark constellation, the Pegasus Square, and right in front of him is Pisces. Now, Pisces, the northern Pisces fish is defined as the Tigris River in Mesopotamia. The southern Pisces fish is the Euphrates River. So literally, you have a deified man named Resting, standing, or Noah, standing at the mouth of the rivers, just as it tells you in the Epic of Gilgamesh flood story. So I'm pretty sure that this is Noah. So if you want to go see Noah, go out, look up in the sky, look at Aries, and remember he's standing at the mouth of the rivers constellation, which is Pisces, and next to west of the rivers constellation is the Ark constellation, the Pegasus Square, which is written Tebat, you know, which is where you get the biblical title for Noah's Ark. So there's an image of it. You got Noah resting, standing at the mouth of the rivers, right next to the Ark. So Noah really is standing eternally at the opening of the rivers constellation, just like it tells you in the Epic of Gilgamesh flood story, which I think is wonderful. The pagan flood story tells you how to find Noah. That is so beautiful. And the book's called The Celestial Code of Scriptures. So anyway, I hope that wasn't too pedantic to your viewers. I don't know. Thank you so
No,
much for letting me present that.
no, really enjoyed that, John. I appreciate that. Thank you.
My pleasure.